related a story of a phone call that he made to his parents from the airport in Salt Lake after completing a 12-week intensive course at the Missionary Training Center and preparing to board a plane to Russia. And he called up his parents and he said, "Mom and Dad, I think I've got the language down." And he said, "There's some things I still need to work out, but I'm almost there." Now, to this student's credit, when he returned and matriculated into our courses, he tested it superior. And he is a very gifted student in languages. In fact, he works for the NSA today. Just as a side note about this particular student, they were throwing all sorts of language at him to try to find a ceiling. And he, as he related it to me, he said, "I was doing fine, and then all of a sudden, it's as though I just collapsed, and I couldn't do anything. And I didn't know why." And they told me afterwards that they resorted to using what we would call criminal language in Russian to try to be able to trip me up. And yeah, they found this ceiling with criminal language. So they put him in a course for criminal language. The next year he was teaching. It's that kind of ability that he had. And interestingly, his name, get this, was Dan Davidson. Go figure, what is it about that name? I don't know. Not the Dan that we know. So now, stepping back a little ways, in 2006, I approached my colleagues about creating an internship program for our students. We have a large number of students that come back from having served missions in Russian-speaking countries and are very skilled in speaking in a very select domain. As Ray sometimes refers to them as hothouse specials. And this is, I think, is a good description. The problem is that when we put them in a real-world situation, oftentimes they find themselves strapped for how to be able to communicate in business, in engineering, or whatnot. And many of these students want to pursue careers in medicine, banking, finance, law, and whatnot, and want to be able to use their Russian. So with the permission of my colleagues, I began exploring possibilities for giving our students this kind of pre-professional experience in Russia, and fortunately was able to come up or find a partner institution in Moscow that could offer us this kind of a quasi-language intensive study, immersion type experience, coupled with pre-professional experience in a sphere that was what the students were wanting to do professionally. Beginning in 2007, we started sending students over, and from the first group on, they were pre and post tested using the ACTIL OPI. Some of them also did the WPT. Those benchmarks proved very useful for us in terms of being able to determine the added value, language-wise, of what they were doing. But over time, I also thought perhaps students would benefit from a self-assessment, both at the beginning of the program and at the end, so as to have a heightened awareness of what kinds of skills were indicative of an advanced or superior level speaker. And hopefully by educating them in those kinds of skills, they would then know what kinds of goals to set for themselves language-wise. And in addition to that, the self-assessment I had in mind would cover issues of cultural knowledge and so forth. Well, I approached Ray this past summer about this idea of putting together a self-assessment survey, and he was generous enough to provide some interesting criteria, or skill descriptions rather, that ACTFL was putting together, which we now know as can-do statements. At the time, they were just piloting this. And so I put together this survey based on the can-do statements. And actually, I have Lydia Roberts to thank for putting it into Qualtrics format and then sending it out to all of the past participants on the program. Now, I didn't have the advantage well, I wanted to just put together some sort of a database, and my student population were those that had already been there and come back. So the way that I formulated the questions was in the form of, at the beginning of the program, this is what I could do, and at the end of the program, this is what I could do, to try to be able to get a pre and a post type feel. So with that, we then administered this survey to students that had been on the program, but we only kept the reports of those students for whom we also had pre and post OPIs, because we also wanted to compare it against that instrument to see to what degree there was some correlation. So the survey sent out, we gathered the results, and then a colleague of mine, Dan, approaches me and he says, you know, Tony, there's some really important research in this area, and I think we could do something with this. I, quite honestly, did not have a research agenda in mind other than wanting to know how my students were reporting. But I have my colleagues here, Dan and Troy, to thank for actually turning this into what I consider to be some important findings and research in this area. So with that, I'm actually going to turn the time over to Dan, who's going to kind of contextualize this research into literature, and then Troy, who's going to analyze the findings.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that introduction. I wanted to start off by just personally thanking those of you who are guests to our community, who have come a long ways to be here. It's good to have you here today. And also those who, from our community, who have shown up today to provide support and to listen to what we have to say. I want to, actually, is this a remote? Is this it, Troy? No. Oh, right here. Okay, great, thank you. So I want to start by kind of giving you an introduction to self-assessment and talking a little bit about some of the advantages of self-assessment. A lot of people question the value of self-assessment and wonder why in the world a person would administer something like this. But there are good reasons for this. So I'd like to talk a bit about the value of self-assessment. Then I'll talk a little bit about some issues related to timing of self-assessment. And then I'll just talk a little bit about use of self-assessment in sort of experiential language learning. I guess settings where students go study abroad, intern abroad, where they're learning on their own or something like that, and where it might be difficult to administer a more objective measure due to either lack of availability of testers or lack of access to those participants because they're spread all over the world and so forth. So in terms of practicality, that's one issue that I just mentioned, that if you have people who are distributed all over the place, then I don't know, has anyone in here tried to give ILR or give OPIs to students all over the world? Logistically, how does that work out, Galal?
It's a nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. So, but if I set up a survey, an online survey, and I have students come in and take the survey, it's pretty straightforward. They can do it any time of the day. It's very easy to distribute to them if they have computer access. Even if you don't, you can, as a program, hand out paper copies and so forth and get them back very quickly. So it has that definite advantage. In terms of reliability, most of the evidence shows that they're fairly reliable. Students consistently rate themselves in a similar manner. And if you look at internal consistency, there's pretty good consistency there as well. As Tony pointed out, one advantage is that it can promote learner autonomy. Learners can think a lot about their experiences, about what they're doing, what they're capable of doing, what they're not capable of doing, reflect on that, and then, again, make an effort to improve in specific areas. And most important to me in some respects is that if you look at the value of those experiences, you or I might not be able to measure what a student gets out of them, right? But if they can see the value, who has invested in it? The faculty member or the student? If the students invested a lot in this experience and they can self-assess and see that value themselves, then to me, that's important. And so that's one of the benefits, again, of self-assessment. So just some of the research on self-assessment. This, by the way, there's quite a bit of variability, so I have to be careful, but I thought I'd just give you some general tendencies that I see in the literature on self-assessment. They can correlate fairly well with objective measures, especially if you look at certain areas like certain disciplines, math, science, etc., where things are pretty straightforward. You got a right answer, a wrong answer, and so forth. Students can be pretty good at self-assessing. One other note is the accuracy tends to increase with proficiency. So lower level learners who study for a few months sometimes can be overly confident. They think they can do much more than they can. But as students get higher and they use the language more, they tend to understand better what is required in specific situations, and therefore they become better at self-assessing. So related to that, the more experience a person has with the task, the better they are at self-assessing. If you've never been there, never done it, never seen that even, or maybe seen it but never actually been in that situation or tried to put yourself in that situation, then you're not going to be very good at self-assessing typically. So in terms of language studies, there's been quite a bit of research in this area. Oscarson is one of the main people. All of a sudden other names aren't coming to me, but anyway, there's been some good research, a good range. In fact, Diane Strongkraus here has done some research with placement in particular at our English Language Center here using self-assessment. So really, the results are kind of mixed. We tend to see in some studies the correlations are fairly high, and then in other studies they're very low. So there's quite a broad range, and there are some explanations for that that I'm not going to get into a lot today. I will talk about some issues. The lowest for reading comprehension, pretty reasonable typically for speaking, which is what we're focusing on in our study. Things that can affect self-assessment, cultural background can affect self-assessment. Which cultures might tend to assess themselves lower? I don't want to overgeneralize, but yeah, typically the research shows that Japanese and Koreans and Chinese as well, but more so Japanese and Koreans who are in the research tend to assess themselves lower than others in particular. That group in particular. There's some other, in terms of high assessments, there are kind of mixed results there, but that's the tendency that we do see. In,
are you talking about language only, or are you talking about across the board?
Language in particular, yes. Right. There's been research in other areas as well, and yes, we see kind of similar patterns there also. But I'm not as familiar with that, but I am familiar with the language, more familiar with the language research, and that's a general tendency we see. Yes?
Do you see the same I don't want to call it a problem, same phenomenon in cross genders?
You know, there's, in the language research, gender doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. In some of the other areas, like math and science, and again, I'm not as familiar in those areas, but the reading that I've done shows that there is a little bit more of a gender difference in things like math and science than there is in language studies. But Diane, you did a study and you didn't find any difference in terms of gender, right? So culture was more of an issue than gender was in her study and in several others. So yes?
A lot of comments I can make, but
that's okay.
A certain amount of experience in Asia, and I would postulate that most Koreans and Japanese, and others might know more about Chinese. There's a difference, a marked difference between female Koreans and male Koreans.
Yeah, there could be. I don't think there's been enough research in that area for us to know. So, and it tends to be more Japanese and Korean. I said Chinese because there's one study that I'm aware of that included some Chinese learners and not that many of them, and they tended to assess a little lower, but I don't even remember if they looked at statistical significance. So it tends to be more Japanese and Koreans. So.
What cultures over-assess?
You know, I'm trying to remember. In your study, Diane, was there a specific culture that
Well, it had
over-assessed?
to do with the group too, and they
Yeah.
were Spanish speakers. So
Yeah, so in her group, English language learners, we have quite a few Spanish speakers at our English Language Center. So yeah, if you compared the two in particular, you'd see the Spanish speakers assessing their English ability much higher than the, I shouldn't say much, but significantly higher anyway than the Japanese and Korean.
A
So
long time ago, Donna, Shohami found that university students in Tel Aviv over-assessed their English abilities,
uh-huh.
with the exception that immediately following an OPI, they were more accurate.
Okay, yeah, I haven't read that study. If you could, Ray, don't forget to share that with me. Okay, all right. So overall, a lot of it comes down to things like the specific wording of the items and so forth. There's a variation. Also, I don't think I mentioned it here, but one thing I want to point out is it depends on what we're comparing. If we look at correlations, so if you're comparing a global proficiency measure with self-assessments versus something that's very specific, or if, for example, I give students, say, a test of reading comprehension, and then they sit down and assess themselves after they've taken the test, that's a very different situation in terms of looking at correlations. They've just experienced something. It might be very focused. It's not as global as, say, speaking. So you can see where some of these differences would come in terms of correlations. But wording is a very important issue. And the more specific the wording, in particular, the more we tend to see that self-evaluations are more accurate, or they correlate more closely with objective evaluations done by another person. So I'm going to stop here and tell you a story because you've been hearing about language for a while, and I thought I would just tell you an interesting personal story, okay, that illustrates something. So I have a son who is a hurdler. This is not him. He would like to think that's what he looks like, but he won't let me take any pictures of his meets. He says, you can come all you want, just don't take any pictures. So I don't have him, but just imagine this is my son, okay? My son was in track and got asked by the coach to be a hurdler. And he's like, I've never hurdled. I've never thought about doing that. I'm not really interested in that. But the coach convinced him. So he spent a lot of time observing hurdlers. He actually, down our street, he drew some lines and he practiced hurdling, as if those were hurdles there. He didn't have the physical hurdles, right? And then he actually had set up kind of a hurdle and he practiced going over that, right? So in a pinch, I guess one of their hurdlers, and one of the reasons he was asked is they were short on hurdlers, and one of the best hurdlers was unable to run in one meet. So the coach said, do you think you can hurdle? Do you think you can run this? And he said, yeah, I think I can do that. I'm pretty confident, right? And this was about a week before. He felt pretty good, right? The event gets closer, and the day of, what happens to him? Anyone want to guess? The day of? How is he feeling the day of? Nervous, less confident, right? So he goes out there, he hurdles. My son makes me proud, but he doesn't do as well as he thought he would have a week ago, right? Okay, so after his coach said, how do you think you did? And he gave an evaluation, right? A self-assessment. How accurate was that in comparison to the other two self-assessments? What do you think?
Well, he has a result.
Okay, he has a result to compare to, right? Okay, so long story short, my son practices hurdling and hurdling more and more, gets better and better at it. How accurate was he after, say, a year of practice at self-assessing? Okay, much better, much, much better. And he knew when he was going to choke a little better too. He knew when he was going to do well. Okay, so I shared this self-assessment stuff and told my son I was going to share this, and I didn't have a part B to share with you. And then he said, well, this is interesting, Dad, because at one point he said, let's have you hurdle the higher hurdles. And he said, how do you feel about that? And he said, I think I'm going high enough. I could probably do that, right? So the coach put a couple of higher hurdles in, and he made it over a couple of those hurdles. And he was feeling pretty confident about hurdling higher hurdles. Well, when he lined up all higher hurdles, what happened? He didn't do so well, right? Okay, so please keep this story in mind, because now I'm going to share with you some of the self-assessment stuff, and Troy's going to share some results. It's very relevant, okay? We're often overly confident when we have less experience, okay? Our confidence decreases as the event gets closer sometimes. We just get a little nervous, right? Okay. Our estimates are more accurate when we've had some experience. You can see this in this hurdling example, right? And then our rulers kind of change over time as well. If you think about it, anyone ever done anything like a hurdle or like a high jump? How high did it look the first time you looked at it?
It looked like I could go over fairly easily.
Okay, all right. So you think it looked like you could go over ferry. Anyone have the experience of thinking it was way too high? I'll never get over that? Yep. Okay, so without experience, we have this ruler that might say, oh, that's really tall, right? Or that's not so tall, right? Then we get experience. Does our ruler change? Does our estimate of what's tall and what's not change? Okay, so that's important to keep in mind, especially with our results today. So we use then now actually it's also called retrospective pre-post testing. We had them, as Tony said, and this was kind of accidental, and I thought Tony did it on purpose, by the way. So, but because I think it's a great idea, because students had the same ruler when they self-assessed following the experience. Okay, so they're what they thought was tall. Okay, they have this experience, and so it's a similar experience. If we had compared my son's self-evaluation a week prior to his first hurdling activity and his self-evaluation after doing it, we would have seen a very different picture, right? His idea of what's tall and what's difficult changed. Okay, so anyway, that's one of the main points with this pre-post. So I'm going to turn the time over to Troy, and then I'll probably comment some later on when we get back to the results.
Okay, well, so we actually looked at 3 questions with this data. We wanted to analyze the reliability of the self-assessment instrument, the then-now can-do statements. Then we wanted to see the extent that the survey items, like the can-do statements, ascended in the hierarchy of difficulty that were based on the ACTFL guidelines. So were the intermediate tasks, did they consider those the easiest ones? Did they consider the distinguished tasks the hardest? And then could we use the self-assessment items to predict OPI scores? So I'm going to show you a little bit about the instrument. The idea is, and Dan brought his hurdle thing, and I actually pulled up, and I had a series of slides about hurdles that I've used in assessment things in the past. I thought, this is great. I'm just going to throw this slide in here. Basically, we're using invariant measurement. So we wanted to use Roche modeling with item response theory. Okay, and those are some big words. I'll try to, if you're not familiar with it, but the concept is that a person at this ability level has all of the ability of a person underneath them. And they can hit a higher hurdle. These are hurdles on this side. And so the idea being that I appreciated the presentation that was just prior to ours, that a person has the ability to use that, the highly structured language, but also has the ability to go over to do the shorter sentences, simpler language. They have the repertoire. And so the idea is that people at this ability level, you get the most information when the item is about, you have a 50-50 probability of making it over the item. That's where you get the most information about the item and that the person is when the item's difficulty level is about the person's ability. The item difficulty level and person ability level are 50-50 probability. Okay, so I will come back to this slide later as we talk about how the items actually function. So we looked at, the respondents, what their characteristics would have, and then what the items would have. So we took the can-do statements from ACTFL, and you can just find them from their website if you just Google ACTFL can-do statements. And then Tony chose the ones from the intermediate high up to the distinguished. And I'm going to show you a few of the statements just to give you an idea of the range. So at the intermediate high, I could exchange information related to areas of mutual interest. And there was a 5-point scale. could not do this even with extensive preparation, unsure as to whether I could do this, could do this with extensive, could do this with minimal preparation, and could do this without any preparation. So that was the scale that they were rating themselves on for this the can-do statements. So intermediate high, creating with the language, asking, answering questions. We get to the advanced where it's comparing contrast. You're speaking, the text type is going to be more paragraph level. It's going to be narration in all the major time frames, resolving unexpected complications. We get to the superior, supporting opinion and clearly and precisely constructing hypotheses, discussing complex information in debates or meetings, and then up to the distinguished. I could use my language persuasively to advocate a point of view that was not necessarily my own. So characteristics of that distinguished level, or the level 4 on the ILR. Okay, so to answer the first question on the reliability of the scale, we took the respondents, and there were 36 people that responded, that took the question, that did this instrument and also did OPIs. And first I'm going to look at the instrument, the can-do statements, then now. Using the 5 categories, you'll see that this axis here is the person ability level, or the construct here is their how they perceive themselves in the language. Okay? So people over here have a high perception of their ability level. People here have a low perception of their ability level. This axis here is probabilities. So someone with a low self-assessment would most likely be in the 1 category. Someone with a middle self-assessment, I can't even speak, would be a 3. Someone with a high thing would be in the 5. Okay, the scale functions quite well. In fact, this is sort of textbook type of distributions. The one thing that is interesting is that we don't have a lot of use in these lower categories. So only 1% of only 1% of the respondents actually chose category 1. Only 6% of the responses were in category 2. So we could possibly collapse 1 and 2. But in general, what this is saying is that people are pretty confident. With every statement, they were saying, yeah, I can do this. They were never saying, I couldn't do this. I mean, well, they were rarely saying, I couldn't do this. Okay? Now, this slide is too small, and I actually printed this out so that you could actually take a look at it. This is a vertical scale map, and if you think of the hurdles that were before, with this being the items on this side, and this being the people on this side, what this shows is this shows where the people are, and then the 50% probability level next to them, and then what category they would most likely be. And you'll see that I have a then column and a now column. So if we look at WAH, this student here was a 7 for their pre-OPI, their OPI prior to the internship. When they came back from their internship, they were an 8. So a 7 would be, we converted the OPIs to a 10-point scale. So 10 is superior, 9 is advanced high, 8 is advanced mid, 7 is advanced low. So this person started at advanced low, came back with an advanced mid. And we know that when this person started, he or she responded to the advanced mid question, would have had a 50% probability of being in category 3, saying, yeah, I can do this with extensive prep. That's just so that I like data-rich graphics so that you can sort of get your own impressions of it. So I'm not going to spend too much time other than just explaining that's what it is. And on the back page, this is from an article we're working on. This is the explanation of that graph that you could use at your own leisure. So when we look at the separation statistic, we see that there's a 0.96 separation among the students. Okay, so that we see that this range of variability of the students is really great. It's a high range. So that means the students are different from each other. And the instrument has that internal consistency. If the instrument did not have that kind of reliability, we would see all the students sort of lined up in one single line without being able to tell who had more and who had less. Well, notice that the items have a smaller range than the students. And so when we look at the item, it's 0.95. So it's still a really, it's still really reliable, but it's slightly smaller because there's not as much differentiation. We know that from the separation strata that we can divide the people into about 5 different groups. And the questions here we can divide into about 4 different difficulty levels. So, response to the first question, as an instrument itself, this instrument is very highly reliable in its internal consistency. Are there any questions about the reliability of the instrument?
Of course, go ahead.
All right. Now the next question is, to what extent do the survey items ascend in the hierarchy based on the actual speaking proficiency guidelines? So our assumption was that the intermediate items would be lower. We'd see intermediate, advanced, superior, distinguished. What we find is that they do ascend, but it's not statistically significant. There's substantial overlap on all of the items. So the items do ascend. There's no statistical difference when you do an ANOVA. So it could be that the instrument as created needs refinement if we want to actually have better specifications at those levels. We also know that in general, the students are all up here and the items are down here, meaning that in general the students were rating these items as all fairly easy to do, regardless of their actual ability. Even people that were, advanced low were rating was advanced low, he's sort of rating the superior item as a pretty easy item to do. He can do it without extensive preparation. So not necessarily as reflective as we would hope, but they still show that they are ascending. And so it's a good start that we could maybe revise the questions and help them be a little more, help maybe what Dan said, help them learn a little bit more about what the different levels mean so that they could adequately self-assess. Now the big question is, can we use this as a, does the OPI, is it a predictive of the OPI? How is that relationship? So we looked in 3 parts. First, we looked to see if the OPIs changed over time, the pre and the post. Then we looked to see if the then was, if the then and now, if there was a difference between the then and the now parts of the test. And then we looked at the relationship between the then now scores and the OPIs. So here's a distribution. If you would imagine your bell curve turned on its axes, this is the this is before the internship, their OPI, and this is after their internship. So we see that before their internship, the advanced mid was the mode. Most people were at the advanced mid. After their internship, it was advanced high. So there is a shift. There's a shift. And one thing to note about this distribution, it's not a normal distribution in that the mean, median, and mode are not the same. It's a skewed distribution. We don't have the distribution isn't here with most people there. So it's a skewed distribution. And so we did a Wilcoxon matched pairs signed ranks test because first of all, it gets into the statistics of you're assuming interval level data, and OPI scores are not necessarily interval level data. And then the distributions aren't normal. What we found is that there is a significant difference between pre-test and post-test. We had 12 instances where there were people with the exact same rating and 2 instances where a person was rated lower. But in all of the other instances, there was increase.
Out of how many?
There were 36.
36.
Now, this this was the then-now scores. We'll notice here that this distribution is a lot, the distribution size is normal. We see the mean is here, this is the interquartile range, so this is more of a normal distribution for both the then, how they self-assessed, and then the now, how they self-assessed. And we did find that there was a significant difference in their perceived ability of how they improved. So we know that their OPIs, they perceived that their OPIs, they actually got better. Self-assessment, they perceived they got better. So we did a correlation between the two. And since the OPI was not interval, we didn't treat that as interval level data, we went with the Spearman's row ranked, a Spearman correlation instead of a Pearson. We find that there is a slight relationship, but it's not significant at the, in the classical sense of p being less than 0.05. There actually have been a lot of statisticians saying that we get too excited about looking at p-values, that really we should be looking at relationships and effect sizes. And what do we know? Well, we know that there is a significant variation in how people self-assess, but they do seem to have there is a small relationship between their perception of how they did and their actual score. One limitation to this is that whenever you're doing correlations, it's dependent on the distribution of the two scores having the same shape. So since we're doing a correlation between a skewed distribution and a normal distribution, it limits how high it can actually be. But it is promising to see that at least there's some relationship. There is a relationship. It's a small to medium effect. We also look to see the difference in the gain score. So we took the difference in their then now and the difference in their pre and post to see if there was a strong relationship there. It was about the same relationship. So I think at this point we're just going to, so the question, research question 3, the relationship between self-assessment and OPIs are slight with a small to medium effect size. Self-assessments can provide some useful information, but it's insufficient to replace external assessment. So you wouldn't want to use self-assessment as the only instrument, but it is really, for the value of letting people be aware of what they're doing and sort of a gauge on that manner. It is very promising. So I think at this point we can just.
Yeah, I think so. I wanted to make sure this point was up there, but I also wanted to say that, one of the problems is, again, the more specific you get, the better people are going to be at self-assessing. So we might need to refine these items, make them more specific, provide examples. It might be useful for them to see people interacting in what is a superior task, for example, and they then say, could I do that or couldn't I? Another thing that the research shows is that if you ask people to provide reasons why they couldn't do something, that sometimes that leads to better self-assessment because they think, oh wait, what am I missing that would keep me from doing that? And therefore their estimates become more reasonable. So we'll probably play with some of these things, but one of the things that's occurred to us, and I wanted to come back to this hurdler thing, is that, you remember I told you my son that they upped the hurdles and he did a couple of them just fine, right? So he was pretty confident. Well, we're wondering if some of our students might have had that experience where they've encountered, they've observed, or maybe even had something that's kind of, superior-like or whatever, but they don't have a lot of experience, but they've got just enough to feel like, yeah, I can keep doing this, right? I can make all those hurdles. And in reality, maybe they can't. So that's something we want to look at too. So.
And to that point, keep in mind that the students who were responding to this survey had lived over there for a period of time, most of them for 2 years, and had been complimented, I'm quite certain, on many occasions as to their language ability. But keep in mind that they were also speaking within a very narrow domain. And so they were in many ways, I think, drawing on that sort of thinking and saying, Yeah, I think I can do these other things. I think I can do that.
And we really don't know that much about the types of experiences that they have and what they're actually doing with the language in internships or study abroad and so forth. And so that's a rich area of investigation right now that people are looking at. But as we better understand that, we can see, okay, do they actually encounter something that's superior, or how often do they encounter that? Do we need to create that for them, which Kirk's done a lot of with the Arabic program, providing speaking partners for the students who push them to that level, to the superior level and so forth. So.